Okay, so this is 2 minutes past 2, and we are starting our HO Colloquium. Today's speaker is Nathaniel Matthews. Nathaniel Matthews recently completed their PhD in Applied Mathematics with a focus on coronal physics at CU Boulder, advised by Natasha Flyer. They are now beginning a postdoc at NASA Goddard with Barbara Thompson. Today, Nathaniel Matthews' talk will be on computational modeling for 3D data reconstruction of solar coronal magnetic fields. To Nathaniel now.
Thank you. Just share this. Great. So, yeah, so this is a talk on computational modeling to reconstruct coronal magnetic fields that are, currently present in the sun or recently present in the sun. So there's 3 main publications that this work is based in. One of them is pending or is submitted for publication currently. So just to overview this, we want to model space weather, of course, and that comes from structures in the corona. And in order to model the space weather, we need an initial state to pass into some time-dependent model of the solar wind or coronal mass ejections or whatever we're looking at. But observations of the sun are limited, they're difficult to get, and a lot of the time they have issues about degeneracies of the magnetic field structures or line of sight integration degeneracies because multiple perspectives are difficult, tomographic techniques are difficult. And so in order to do this kind of inverse problem, we need really 3 things. We need a forward solver or a generative model that takes some set of parameters and produces a magnetic field that's self-consistent and the sort of magnetic field the sun active regions might have. And we need a method that constructs synthetic observables from a model like that. Something like Sarah Gibson's forward model does this. And we need an optimization method that computes a cost function of how different those synthetic observables are from true observables in the sun and searches them to sort of find the observables that best match some sort of ground truth or true observation of the sun. So to just sort of abstract that idea away from solar physics for a moment, and then we'll come back, we're trying to find some cost function. That cost function is the difference between synthetic and true observations. And we're trying to minimize that cost function over a parameter space. That parameter space is defined by the forward model of magnetic fields that we've built. So this is the problem that we're going to try to solve. I'm going to provide some more background on that stuff, and then I'm going to build a forward, essentially version of the whole thing that does this kind of optimization with a simple forward model and simple synthetic observation calculation. And then we're going to dwell in on the part of that that is most in need of improvement, which will be the forward model part. And we'll build a more realistic version of that, and then we'll inspect some of the ramifications of that. So just to reiterate, there's observations that we can take of the sun, solar surface observations and coronal observations. And there is a lot of reason to believe that we want to incorporate these coronal observations of sort of the volumetric observations above just the solar surface, which can be a little bit more difficult to wrangle with. Their line of sight integrated and they're degenerate in some ways, but they provide us information that observations of just the solar surface don't have. So we want to be able to incorporate both of these distinct pieces if we can. Magnetograms, of course, of the solar surface also have degeneracy issues with them, especially in the transverse components that we'll inspect a little bit. But for the most part, I'm going to assume that we can have sort of vector valued magnetograms of the solar surface later when I'm building the forward model. The physical regime of the corona, generally speaking, is magnetohydrodynamics. These equations are really complicated, really difficult to work with. They're time dependent. They're fully nonlinear. They're a little bit more than we are going to be able to work with in the context of running many simulations to try to find the best one. So we're going to use a simplification of this. In particular, we're going to use magnetohydrostatics for the majority of this talk. Because it's simpler than MHD, it's still fully nonlinear. And of course, there's further simplifications of this we can take. There is nonlinear force-free fields, there's linear force-free fields, or potential fields that are very common. Especially nonlinear force-free fields are particularly common when people are doing this kind of work and they're modeling coronal magnetic fields. Nonlinear force-free fields have problems associated with them for our purposes. In particular, there's a few issues, actually. First of all, there's reason to believe that plasma does have an impact in the corona, so we can't just ignore it. There are simulations, high degree simulations of MHD where plasma beta is non-zero, pretty high up in the corona. And there's also lab results that find that the plasma streamers don't perfectly follow magnetic field lines in laboratory plasma that's meant to simulate the corona. So there's issues like this. It's also a problem that the photosphere is certainly not force-free. That's how we define it, right? It's denser there. So there's pre-processing that we have to do if we want to use photospheric observations in nonlinear force-free field modeling. And those pre-processing techniques are kind of, there's different ones, but they all have their own issues that we have to wrangle with. And the most important problem for us is that it's ill-posed. A given lower boundary condition can have infinitely many solutions in nonlinear force-free fields, which means that if we're trying to, remember, we're building an inverse problem solver, we need one solution for a given parameter set to be our cost function value that we're trying to minimize. So if our cost function is not a real function, right, it doesn't pass the vertical line test, the same set of parameters could have two different valid nonlinear force-free fields if our parameters are lower boundary condition. So that's a huge problem for us. So that's why we're going to focus mostly on magnetohydrostatics. So that's going to be our generative model of physics. We're also later on going to have an optimization technique, and optimizing this kind of problem, just to go back, remember, we're looking at cost function of observations, right? We're building synthetic observables and we're comparing them to the real one, and we're trying to minimize that difference. And we'll have some sort of parameter space right here that we're taking a bunch of different samples and we're running this forward model many times. And so this kind of optimization technique is very tricky for nonlinear, non-convex optimization problems like the ones we'll be dealing with. There are solutions to do that. In particular, we're going to use something called a trust region style technique that I'll explain a little bit, but basically it takes samples, right? We'll evaluate the model a few times, and then we'll try to build a rough approximation of what the whole cost function looks like. And we'll refine on that. So we're going to start by building the whole thing in a simple way. So remember, I said that there's three things we need: a forward model that takes parameters and gives a self-consistent magnetic field the sort that the sun's active regions could have. We need something that can take a magnetic field like that and produce a synthetic observation. What we would see with something like the COMP telescope, something like that. And then a method that then compares that observation to the true observation and minimizes the difference between them. To test this model, we're going to have a ground truth, which is just a particular version of the forward model, the first part, and we'll pretend that that's the real sun. We'll take a synthetic observation of it, and we'll try to reconstruct it. So the three components that we're going to use the three components that we'll use are the flux rope insertion model for the generative model. I'll talk a little bit about that. The forward code by Gibson et al. For our synthetic observations, and the radial basis optimization approximation method for our optimization technique. And I'll talk a little bit about that as well. So the flux rope insertion model is a model which is a force-free field model, which, remember, like I said, has some issues, but it's simpler than MHS. So we'll start with this and we'll see how it works. It begins by taking a potential field extrapolation of the line of sight component of photospheric data, and by hand you carve out a little cavity tube of no magnetic field, and you trace based on observations of the sun of where you think the filament is, and then you fill that tube in with a parameterized flux rope, and then you run a magnetofrictional relaxation scheme to get everything into force-free balance. The two parameters that the inserted flux rope is based on will be our two-dimensional parameter space that we'll try to optimize in. So that's the idea. We have this two-dimensional parameter space that we'll try to search for the best parameters that match our ground truth. Those parameters are axial and poloidal flux of the initial inserted flux rope before magnetofrictional relaxation. Of course, then to do the synthetic observations, we need to put plasma in to actually produce the light to make observations. So we place a hydrostatic atmosphere with an isothermal temperature so it doesn't mess up any of the magnetic field balancing that we've done. We normalize by intensity our observations so that we don't want that, we don't really trust that hydrostatic plasma very much, so we don't want it to have a huge impact on the final output. So when we do our observations, our Stokes observations that we generate, polarimetric line of sight integrated observations, we'll normalize those by the plasma by intensity, just to lessen the dependence on the plasma that we've inserted that we don't really trust. The third component is this optimization technique. And so basically what we'll do is here's our two-dimensional parameter space of axial and poloidal flux of the inserted flux rope. And we'll have one of those be sort of the ground truth. We'll generate a flux rope with a given axial and poloidal flux. And then we'll call that the ground truth. We'll build a synthetic observation of it. And then we'll pretend we've forgotten what the true axial and poloidal flux were, and we'll try to recover it. So this will allow us to measure our error, both in terms of the actual magnetic field and in terms of our parameter space, how far off we ended up from what the true parameters were. We do that by running the model with a bunch of different axial and poloidal fluxes. And then we interpolate a smooth surface that goes through all of the observation differences that we found. We just do a an L2 difference, pixel by pixel difference of the two images. And then we minimize that smooth interpolated cost surface. And then when we hone in on a region, we do more evaluations where we think the minimum is, and we just sort of iterate on that. So we end up with a bunch of evaluations of our forward model and our observation synthesis near where we think the true parameters are. So we did this, like I said, from a representative of the forward model. And that allows us to measure both the magnetic field error and the that allows us to measure both the magnetic field error and the parameter space error. So in particular, we note that these were some of our true values. We did it for 9 different true flux ropes, and with different axial and poloidal fluxes. And we find that we can recover the axial flux very well. The poloidal flux we can't recover quite as well, but it's still very close. And it's worth noting that in these tests, we're looking sort of down the barrel of the flux rope. The coronal images that we're using, the flux rope is sort of coming out of the screen at you here. It's right here. So with that in mind, we recover the axial flux pretty well, but the poloidal flux reasonably well, especially for large magnitudes. But there's, error in the single percents. We also look at a bunch of different magnetic field type errors and electric field current type errors. And we report those. Those are also quite low. So we're doing well not just in the parameter space, but in the actual magnetic field. We're able to recover the true flux rope based on just using the same line of sight photospheric observation. And we just sort of recovered our ground truth, which was a version of this model, without remembering what the parameters were supposed to be. It's worth noting that our best fit does have some minor differences. So here's the ground truth flux rope for one of the 9 cases we did, and the best fit flux rope. And there's some small deviations. Here's the observations. There's some small deviations in those. It's not a perfect recovery, but it's quite good. So this is very promising results for our whole idea of building an inversion framework in this way, where we have some forward model, we run it a bunch of times. We have very low errors. This is great news. It seems like it's indicative that the whole routine is possible. The main issue that I would point out here, if I was just a third party looking at these results, is that we've demonstrated that we can recover a version of the model that we're using to do the recovery, right? We're saying that here's the forward model that we're using for the first part of this inversion framework that's parameterized, and we can recover a specific instance of that with given parameters. We have not shown that we can generalize this to magnetic fields that did not come from that model. And in fact, I would argue that probably the flux rope insertion model cannot do this because it's so limited in its scope. It's just parameterized by 2 parameters, which is not very many. And it's a force-free field model, which has these non-uniqueness issues that I talked about before. So we're going to build next a more general forward model that can accommodate some of these problems. So I'm going to build a more complicated Magneto hydrostatic forward model to socket into that first part of the DocFM, the inversion framework. So what does the forward model need to do to be able to be put in there? It needs to be able to represent more general structures. That's the whole point. And I would also like to remove any sort of human interaction. Remember, the first step of the flux warp insertion model is sort of to draw out this cavity by hand, looking at observations. We want to not have to do that because we need to run this model a bunch of times, right? We want to have as little human intervention as possible. And we want it to be parameterized in some sense. We want to be able to have a part of it that can be changed by the search optimization routine. So we're going to use forced magnetohydrostatics. And this right-hand side, this is magnetohydrostatics, just to recall. This right-hand side of the plasma forcing, that's the part that we'll parameterize. So in general, you might say that it's kind of unrealistic to build a forward model of the corona where I assume that the plasma forcing in the corona is known. That's because in general, we won't assume that it's known, but any particular run of the forward model will impose a different plasma forcing. So as we're searching for the best magnetic field, we'll also end up finding sort of the plasma forcing that's correct in some sense. Of course, magnetohydrostatics has problems, non-uniqueness problems, just like nonlinear force-free fields do. It must, because when the plasma forcing is 0, they're the same. That's something that I'll inspect a little bit at the end of this talk if there's time. So here's how we're going to build this model. We're going to build a discretization. It's going to be a numerical model, right? Of course, there's a discretization. We'll use a fancy one, radial basis functions. We'll generate an initial guess. That initial guess will not be in balance with the plasma forcing we're imposing, and we'll push it into balance. We're not going to use a magnetofrictional scheme for that. It won't be a physical evolution. It's going to be a numerical evolution that just sort of minimizes the difference between the plasma forcing and the magnetic forcing. And then we'll deal with divergence a little bit as we go, but mostly at the end. So to make this a talk that has pictures in it, I'm going to try to be recovering a model as we go. The model that we'll be recovering is not a specific example of the magnetohydrostatic model we're building. It's going to be the Gibson-Woe model. So we're going to see how well we can recover this Gibson-Woe model if we know what the plasma forcing is. There's two different evolutions that we're looking at. There's one where it's sort of barely sticking out of the photosphere, and there's one where sort of the whole sphere Mach structure is sticking out of the photosphere. This is the plasma forcing we'll be imposing for the more evolved case. So you can see kind of that the plasma forcing has some information in it about what the magnetic structure is, but the magnetic structure of the Gibson-Woe model is nonlinear and twisted and much less smooth than the plasma forcing is. Like I said, the discretization we're using numerically for this model is fancy. We're using something called radial basis functions, but the idea is pretty simple. We're going to have a numerical lattice of a bunch of node points, and we'll compute the magnetic field at all of those node points. And we'll build a derivative approximation that is a big matrix that when you pass in a vector that represents the magnetic fields at all of these places, it gives you a derivative of the magnetic fields at all those places. And the way we build that differentiation matrix is sort of the fancy part of this, because radial basis functions can do it even when your nodes are scattered. A lot of methods, standard finite differences, they have to be on a lattice. Finite element is a little bit more general, but hard to work with. Radial basis functions, this is a mathy slide, so I don't want to spend too much time talking about it. But the basic idea is that you solve a big system and you get a matrix that has this kind of banded structure to it. So these matrices are huge, but we can store them in the computer because they're mostly zeros. So the initial guess for our model should be something that is an estimate of the background field. The potential field model is a reasonable place to start, even though the final magnetic field is highly non-potential. So this is the initial guess that we'll be using for the Gibson-Low model. It's also worth noting you can do some fancy stuff with this. If you're running it at different resolutions, the forward model at different resolutions, you can use the low resolution case as an initial guess for the high resolution case and bypass a lot of computational time by doing that. But anyway, the magnetohydrostatic solver, like I said, basically the way it works is it computes how out of balance your initial gas field is. This is going to be highly out of balance, right? Because there's no information in these vertical field lines about the plasma forcing from Gibson-Low. So there will be the plasma forcing is going to be pretty strong, and the potential magnetic field forcing is 0. So we use the discretization differentiation matrices we built before to build a vector that tells us how out of balance we are everywhere in the computational domain. And then we take the derivative of that vector. This is another very mathy slide. But we just get this big matrix, and we can solve this matrix system to reduce the lack of balance in the magnetic field. The way we do that is, again, kind of complicated. The important thing about it is that as we're trying to reduce the plasma forcing, we're also trying to make sure that the divergence in the magnetic field is small, because of course the divergence really should be 0 or close to 0 when we're done. So we're trying to reduce the plasma forcing in a way that also keeps the divergence small. But I don't care terribly much about keeping it exactly 0, because I'll deal with it later. We'll deal with the remaining divergence after this converges, right? And we have where our magnetic field forcing is very in balance with our plasma forcing, right? The residual forcing, the net forcing in the system that would move it, right? We're trying to get a static system. So the residual forcing that would move it is very low. We remove any remaining divergence that's in the system after that. And the way we remove the divergence is by solving this auxiliary system. And we'll end up by cleaning out the remaining divergence. We do it in a way that minimizes the perturbation from magnetohydrostatics that our field has. But we still are going to push a little bit out of the force balance we just worked so hard to get it into. But that's okay, because we're assuming that MHS is really an approximation of what's truly a dynamic system, right? So keeping that approximation perfect is less important than keeping the divergence perfect. But it still won't perturb it very much. These are the results of this numerical method that I've just described. And we can see that our initial guess is very much not like the Gibson-Low model, less or more emerged. But we can still, by using this method, recover the true field lines to a high degree of accuracy. So here is the, in order, the initial guess, the low resolution version of this forward model that I've described that doesn't have too many node points. The more computationally expensive high resolution version that has 8 times as many node points, and then the true field lines from the analytic Gibson-Low model. And you can see that the high resolution case and the true case are almost indistinguishable. That's sort of an I-norm test. We look at these field lines and I'm like, oh, they're the same. We can also compute quantitative error metrics, and those are also good. We have error inside of the magnetic field structure of 1% or less, and the residuals are well behaved. Convergence looks good. This is a method that works and recovered magnetic field lines, and it's not too computationally costly. So those are all the things that we want in the first step of that inversion framework that I talked about. So that's ready to be sort of socketed in and used to try to recover magnetic field lines with this sort of inversion, optimization, synthetic observables structure that I talked about in the first part. How am I doing for time? I want to talk briefly about one of the problems that I mentioned that MHS might have, which is that it could still be non-unique if the plasma is 0. So I want to use the forward model that I built to kind of explore this idea. So remember I said that we need the forward model, the first part of our inversion 3-part framework, to be a function, right? That every set of parameters has one output. And NOFF doesn't do that for boundary condition data. MHS may or may not. So how does that change as we add plasma forcing is the question. So the way we're going to test this is not with an analytic pen and paper calculation of solution space sizes. We're going to run an experiment. And we're going to use this forward model that I built, this numerical method to construct MHS fields, as the tool for this experiment. We're going to construct a magnetohydrostatic field 2 different ways that has the same plasma forcing and the same lower boundary condition, 2 valid magnetohydrostatic fields. And we'll compare how different they are. If they're similar, then we'll say that despite the fact that they were built 2 different ways, they're similar, the solution space is small for this plasma forcing. And if they're very different, then we say, okay, now we have degeneracy non-uniqueness problems. One of the ways we'll build it is the forward solver that I just talked about. The other way we'll build it is the low 1992 model, which is an MHS model. The reason we're using the low 1992 model is because it has a really nice parameterization to it. Not parameter in the sense of the way I've been using it, the inverse problem search parameters. I just mean that there's 2 coefficients in the construction of this analytic MHS field that are physically useful and interesting for this experiment. One of them controls the amount of current that is parallel to the magnetic field, essentially how non-potential it is in a force-free direction. And the other parameter controls how perpendicular electric current, which will need a plasma forcing to balance it. Those parameters are called alpha and A. I did not name them. But solutions look like this. So here we can, the top row is when A is 0, the perpendicular current, the plasma forcing in 4-1. And as we go left to right, I'm increasing alpha, the current that's parallel to the magnetic field. And basically what we notice here is that as we increase alpha, we're sort of twisting the foot points around the central dipole. And as we increase A, we're inflating the field. I've switched these bullet points by accident, but you can see from the picture that as we increase A, the field is sort of rising up out of the photosphere. And as we increase alpha, we're sort of twisting it around. And those 2 effects together can build these sort of intense flux rope structures along the polarity inversion lines. So here's the numerical solutions from the MHS model that I just talked about. And we can see that it didn't really capture the effective alpha at all. But the effective A is largely well preserved. Like look at this bottom middle picture where both of the parameters are non-zero, but A is bigger than alpha. And it looks very similar to this one. A lot of that sort of structure of that flux rope is preserved between them. So it's definitely doing something, but it's not capturing the electric current that's parallel to the magnetic fields pretty much at all. So rather than look at 6 test cases, I look at 500 of them. And here's this sort of alpha A coefficient space. And these are contours of how different the two solutions are. The color in this left picture is how valid the MHS numerical solution is, how well the numerics converged. So when this color is bright, we don't necessarily trust that the numeric field is a valid MHS field. But for the most part, we do trust that. And it's just that it's different from the analytic one. And basically what we notice about these contours is that they're almost all standing straight up. So as you increase alpha, the difference gets worse. But as you increase A, that doesn't happen. And in fact, for a given amount of current, which is the color on this right-hand plot, for a given amount of current as you follow one of these elliptical contours around, the more that current is perpendicular to the magnetic field, the less difference there is between these two MHS solutions. So that tells us that we can use this informatively. Adding plasma forcing decreases the size of our solution space because perpendicular current is the one that's associated with plasma forcing. So that tells us that MHS can give more unique solutions than nonlinear force-free fields can, and it's valid to use in our inversion framework like this, as long as that plasma forcing coefficients are not close to 0. So what have we done here? We've built a full inversion framework with a relatively simple forward model, the flux rope insertion model. And it works, and it's very promising, and it gives good sort of results within self-contained results. But it's not necessarily equipped for true solar observations, which is the eventual end goal. So we built a new forward model and tested it and used it to tell us things about how MHS works. And that forward model seems ready to be plugged into the inversion framework. So the next step is basically to do that, and that's the current state of research in this field, in this body of work anyway. There's a couple other things to do here about the parameter space we're using. The plasma forcing is of course going to be much higher than two-dimensional, and how are we going to handle that? And that's sort of the current body of research. So I'd like to thank collaborators for this, especially Natasha Flyer, Sarah Gibson, Kevin Dalmas, Doug Nietzschke, funding sources that supported this work. Yeah, that's all I have to talk about for this. Thank you.
Thank you, Nathaniel. Very nice talk, exciting. So we open the room for questions. Phil?
Hi, Nathaniel. I'm not sure we've met.
Hi.
But I really enjoyed your presentation. And I have a couple of questions. One of which is simple. What's on the denominator of the chi-squared? The sort of cost function that you had. I think I missed that one as a result of.
Yeah, let me back up here.
Yeah. The reason I'm asking is because, let's see, you have to, the only thing you know about is the observations and
right
in this whole model. So that has to be an observed minus computed over some kind of variance that comes from the observations, does it?
So the chi-squared, yeah. So we're looking at pixel by pixel difference in various Stokes parameters, and we try both both of these. But that is and we normalize by the white light intensity at all of those pixel values. Is that your question?
Okay. Not quite, but that's okay. I'll take a look at some of your papers, which I confess I wasn't aware of actually. So, but it's great that you're working on this. The other one involves something similar. This plot you've got here is actually very much what I wanted to ask about. You fill the available corona with plasma using a radial drop-off with of the plasma pressure with height, and you specify temperature or something. So in the case where the corona is an active region, you pretty much are going to have a non-space filling component that's going to dominate the light. So, I mean, as far as we understand what the fine structure of an active region looks like, which is obvious in the corona, which is obviously open to question, but so when you fill your volume with plasma, that means you're measuring every single, your observations contain information from every single sort of voxel in the volume around the sun. But if you have something that's actually more sort of stochastically populated, the field lines are just occasionally populated with plasma that are contributing, then I'm just wondering if you thought about analyzing something which is not volume filling and seeing what happens to those to this solution, because if you're not illuminating all the plasma, you've got no information about the magnetic field in that region. But you do have constraints in div B, which is going to do something to help with that, but you don't have the solenoidal you don't have the current component, which is constrained as far as I can see.
Yeah, that's a really good observation, and that's something that the more generalized MHS model can emulate because the plasma can be totally absent from some areas, but it's unclear what an effect that will have on reconstruction attempts. It's possible that those magnetic fields will just be sufficiently constrained by the magnetic fields around them that we do have plasma around we can observe, but that's not currently clear. So that is something that we'll be able to investigate with the new model, but I don't have a good answer for right now.
Okay, that's great, and congratulations on a nice piece of work.
Thank you.
Sarah?
Yeah, sort of following up on what Phil was just asking. If you have observations from, say, different viewpoints, maybe at some point we have a spacecraft coming from another angle, for example, or different wavelengths of light that illuminates different parts of the plasma along the line of sight, can this be used in your cost function to bring more information?
Certainly, yes. One of the big problems with non-convex optimization like this is how corrugated the cost surface is. There's a lot of little local minima when you have just one line of sight component. But the more data we have from different observations, we can just sort of incorporate all of them. The first part of this that we looked at these different Stokes components and we weighted them individually and summed them up. And the more kinds of observations we have, whether it's different kinds of Stokes observations or different spectra or different points of view, would be the best option. We can sort of include those in the cost function, and it makes it a lot more convexly shaped. It reduces the number of local minima that we have, and that makes the optimization a lot easier. So that kind of data is easy to include to a framework like this and really useful. Thank you.
Other questions? Phil again.
Seeing as hands are not being raised very actively here, I'm just fascinated by this. Now, Alan Paraschiv has developed an entirely different approach which is kind of the opposite, and it would be really great for you guys to talk. But also, I just wonder what you think of this. So he and I've just submitted to one of the journals, I can't remember which one, a paper in which we seek a solution which is of a very different form, based upon the assumption you have filled the volume with plasma, and we have taken the assumption, the opposite assumption, in that pretty much if you see loops in the corona, because it's optically thin, even if there are background loops there, you can the emission you see in IQ, U, and V is simply a sum of those, and you can attempt to using clever imaging or something, basically isolate one tube. And we asked the question, can we solve for the magnetic field vector at a position along the line of sight for a given observation? And that fixes the three-dimensional problem that needs to be solved for the rate of transfer generating Q, U, and V. And what we end up with is a series of, because of the symmetry, we end up, of course, with a series of, say, 2 to 4 ambiguities along the line of sight of where this plasma is emitting. Of course, I'm cheating because you probably haven't seen the paper, but I just wanted to bring your attention to it and wanted to know what you think of that prior assumption versus, say, yours.
Yeah, I would love to read that paper. It sounds really relevant to this body of work. I think that the line of sight degeneracy of where these field line structures are along the line of sight is one of the biggest problems for this, right? So anything you can do to try to narrow that down is going to be really impactful to finding a solution. I will say that it is, I think that it's better to be as general as possible, or it's good to be as general as possible in the assumptions you're making. And my plasma parameterization, right, depending on the different locations in that parameter space, will have largely negligible plasma, or you're placing plasma at isolated areas of the region. And so it's not that I'm filling the whole thing with a bunch of plasma all the time, but rather that it is where the plasma is going to inform the magnetic fields that you end up with. So it sounds like they're not actually extremely different approaches, but I do want to read that paper.
Great, thank you. So I have a question. I know this trust region algorithm for optimization is very powerful. So my question here is, how many parameters are you optimizing here? Like either in these 4 cost functions, you have noted either 3 or 2. So at a time you are, okay.
So in the sort of first part of this talk, the complete DocFM, we were optimizing 2 parameters, which were the axial and poloidal flux of the inserted flux rope. In the more general sort of industrial scale version of this algorithm, we're optimizing parameter spaces in the hundreds, so like 500 parameters or something like that. There's clever tricks that you can do about if you're parameterizing the plasma distribution, right? Naive approach would be every voxel in the corona is a parameter, and it's just how much plasma is there. But if you do stuff like you're parameterizing the Fourier or Chebyshev transform of the plasma, then those coefficients are largely ordered, right? The low modes typically have the highest value of plasma and the largest impact. So you can sort of do a Rome optimization of just the low modes, and then sort of separate that space, take that as known, and then do a roam optimization of the high modes, and then in that way sort of segment your parameter space so that you're only optimizing 100 parameters at a time, which is a lot more tractable.
Thank you. Other questions? Sarah?
Yeah, I've got another one. So your magnetostatic generative function is really very cool. And I still can't get over the fact that you could just generate the spheromac from nothing but plasma information, given that that I think is really remarkable. But as you pointed out, the sensitivity to the line of sight current is less well constrained in that particular generative model. Would there be a way? I mean, we know there are regions on the sun which are more force-free. I mean, are there regions where the nonlinear force-free model is a better generative function? And is there a way of telling the difference if you were trying to generalize this to the whole sun and all aspects of it?
Right. Are there regions that particular force-free models will treat better? Probably yes. Especially, I mean, some of these nonlinear force-free field models are very advanced and have been basically tweaked to recover the kinds of force-free fields that the sun has. Because this is the problem, right? Is that there are many force-free fields that can satisfy a given, even vector-valued photospheric boundary. So finding the right one is kind of the problem. And so are there dedicated NLFF solvers that can do that better than this one for regions that are largely force-free? I think the answer to that is yes. Identifying which regions those are can be tricky, but I mean, you can look at things like, just what is the plasma white light intensity in these regions. If it's very small, then there's probably not a lot of plasma there, and you can sort of find these cavities and do that kind of analysis. I think it would require a lot of human intervention to do, at least in a naive sense. My initial reaction is that it would require a lot of human intervention to do, which is kind of anathema to this sort of work. But I'm confident that there are more advanced methods than I can fathom to do that. So that could be an area of future work.
Matthias?
Hi, Nathaniel. Thank you for this very nice talk. I was wondering, have you tried this method on some of the simulations? I know that during your PhD, you looked at some of my simulations before, but I was not sure if you used this most recent version of your code to test it on that as well.
I have not. There was an earlier version of this code that I did look at those models with before implementing the sort of more advanced RBF-based numerics. And I was just using standard finite differences, but the basic structure was very similar. And I got pretty good results, especially because a lot of your simulations in particular have non-zero plasma forcing in almost the whole domain. And so I recovered those not perfectly, but reasonably well with that less evolved version of this model. So I haven't tried it with this yet, but my expectation is that it could recover them pretty well. That is something that I want to try in the near future.
Phil?
This is just getting more and more interesting. So I'd like to ask the question, do you know how sensitive, it seems to me as if the second part of your talk, you've done a remarkable thing in showing how it recovers a sort of twisted, tangled loop thing from a bunch of upward and downward field lines in a potential state originally. But one of the things you've got there is the symmetry the same in both the model and in the initial state, because I can imagine having, and then you need to have boundary conditions and stuff like this, perhaps in the forward state, but if you've got an imbalance between positive and negative flux over an area, then I don't know to what extent you will recover an explicit loop-like structure like that is explicitly in balance through the photosphere. You see what I'm saying? So does the initial state determine the kind of solution? And worse than that, can it actually determine if you can get a solution or not?
So there's two distinct answers to that. One is that I don't think that the flux balance in particular has a large impact for this. This particular case, I think it is the same. But because the way in which I'm pushing the fields towards force balance is not a physical action, it's not like a time evolution. It's just a numerical Newton descent that pushes the field lines towards balance with the plasma forcing. I don't think the total flux is going to be an impact. Separately, having an initial guess that's good does matter, especially for the sort of force-free level of twist. So when we're looking at the MHS uniqueness part of this, right? And I noted that as we increase the twist, the current in the direction of magnetic field, the results get worse. That's not exactly true. What happens is as you change the current, it gets worse. So if my initial guess was a low 92 solution, which was not potential, but was like here in the middle of the domain is where I would do best. And as it became more potential, I would get worse. So in that sense, the initial guess is good. If your initial guess is very far away from the truth, the method won't converge at all. So you need something that's kind of reasonable. In this case, reasonable in the sense that the background field of the Gibson-Low model is very similar to this.
Okay, this is an interesting, remarkably successful. I mean, that figure itself just absolutely stuns me. And given my knowledge of the ambiguities involved, you know, I got to say that somehow in resolving you've resolved all ambiguities there, and that must be due to the fact that you've got plasma sampled all over through the volume for each line of sight. That's the only thing I can think of, together with the idea that you've got fields anchored at the photosphere of particular distribution and sign. So that's what I think is going on.
It is a vector valued photospheric observation. So I assume that the X and Y components of the magnetic field at the photosphere are known.
And does the photosphere actually enter the chi-squared calculation, or is it just the coronal observations?
Just the coronal observations enter the chi-squared. The photospheric observations are assumed to be known and do have an impact in the forward calculation.
Right.
But not in the chi-squared.
And just to be really awkward, if you'd reverse the polarities in the initial condition that you start with, the potential field, what would happen there?
Just in the initial guess?
Yeah.
I have not done that, but my expectation is that it would not give you as good results as this. You would probably end up with a coronal loop in the right place, but it would not. Because there's no plasma out here, there's a lot of solutions of how sort of these open field lines can be that would press upon and impact the way that the loop itself was structured.
Okay. So anyway, I'll shut up now, but that's really helpful what you described, answering some of the questions I had. Thank you.
Yeah.
So I have one last question. If anyone wants to ask, please go ahead first before me. If not, I ask that question. My question is whether when you increase the number of parameters, does it get worse and worse after a point? Meaning, do you get a fully converged solution of fully converged? I mean, not converged in that sense. Every solution is converged. What I'm asking is whether you get the best optimized solution beyond which it starts getting worse again. Have you seen
In the Rome, the optimization part, you mean?
Mm-hmm.
I will be honest with you, because of computational resource restrictions, I have mostly attempted this problem with not enough parameters. I have certainly not done it yet with too many parameters, so I don't know.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Any other question? If not, let's thank our speaker again. Very nice talk, Nathaniel.
Thank you very much for having me.